introduce Rob Witoff. He's from NASA and Y Combinator. He's the Director of Data Sciences for the IT at NASA JPL Laboratory and Y Combinator startup founder. He founded NASA's inaugural Data Science Incubator Lab, where his team applies new technologies to strategic problems across the agency that enable scientists and engineers to better interact with information. Prior to joining JPL, Witoff founded several successful technology startups, and at JPL he's led Department of Interplanetary Data Visualization Technology and led space station systems engineers for the experimental OPALS laser communication satellite. So let's welcome Rob.
Awesome. Thank you, Gagi. And thank you, everybody, for stopping by this talk. So who's excited today? This is the Python community. We're in San Francisco. We're in Facebook's headquarters. This is the place. Yeah. Awesome. And as that excitement wanes, when you're sick of this talk, lunch, they asked me to tell you, is back in Building 18 where we started. So we'll try to get you out of here on time for that. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that we're doing is at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, so on the other side of this great state. And we're going to talk about a data scientist exploration of the unknown, and we're going to define dark data in just a bit. So why don't we kick this off with a little video. So what we're showing there is we're doing all of this exploration. And of course, that exploration, what that comes back to us as are zeros and ones. It's the data that we're bringing home that we have on the other side of that pipe, not being able to send our astronauts out to the edge of the solar system just yet. We're looking at that data. And so we've been doing this for quite some time. So we're exploring the universe, and that exploration is bringing home data, and it's bringing home a lot of it. So what we're going to look at is how we're enabling NASA to uncover and act on what we call the dark data that's hidden and stored around our laboratory. We're going to look at some things like how we can present and share that data like this inside of our laboratory, and how when we visualize and empower our engineers to use that, we can have some really fun and engaging ways of looking at and seeing that data live and in action. So the situation then that we started looking at is our deep space network is connected in an array of satellites all around our planet, and they're reaching out and communicating with our solar system explorers, which are now past the edges of our solar system. We have these located in 3 locations spread at about 120 degrees around our globe. So regardless of how the Earth is rotated, we can still reach and communicate and pull data home from those explorers. When that data comes home, it's of course processed in our local data centers here, but we've now extended that so we can elastically burst and process that data in specific clouds. So we really have a powerful infrastructure that we can build upon. And this is really important today because the data that we're bringing home is coming back faster and faster. Scaling by the communication distance, what started with microbits per second back in the 1960s is now increasing using things like faster bands of radio frequency communication, and now moving up into the laser communication realm as well. So just like the fiber optics we have on Earth, we're extending those out into space. They're free space laser comm, but it's just like the high speed that we all wish we could get here at home. And this is really happening today. advancements in communication technology through experimental payloads like the Opals project that we've been working on, and is currently on the International Space Station getting ready for its first laser communication downlink from space. And this is really moving quickly. This is about 2 weeks ago. We launched the latest laser communication experiment on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. It's now about 400 kilometers above our head, moving at about 26,000 miles per hour, attached to the International Space Station. And there she was after she left our launch vehicle a couple of weeks ago. So this is the state of how we're advancing our data today. And we've been working on this for quite some time. This is a picture on one of the early Apollo missions where we had operators in Houston, in this case, looking at some of the raw bits of telemetry that were coming home. And we've been growing on this to build into our mission control today, which is still very much alive and well. This is a picture of Mission Control Houston, in Texas, of course, where our operators are controlling the International Space Station and some of our explorers around our planet and around the solar system. And with our data science hats on, we took a look at the landscape and we wanted to see just what kind of data do we have inside here. And we looked at all the official systems that we had, and we counted about 209 data sources that we're using to make this possible. These are 209 databases or data stores that we're collecting all the information necessary to do some really out-of-this-world kind of stuff. But when we think about that a little bit more, and when you think about your organization, we've all got our official data stores, but what about what's not documented, right? Who wasn't satisfied with the existing solution? I see some heads nodding, and you created your own solution, right? You've got that capability to do that, and if you don't have the tool you need, you'll find that solution. And what we think of when we look around our organization, and I'm sure many of yours as well, is something like this.
We have top men working on it right now.
So we've got these crown jewels of our data.
Top men.
Right? We may have stored them, archived them, locked them up, but what could we do if we knew what was out there? Hopefully we're not spoiling the movie for anyone. Right, so that takes us to our epic theme today, which is this. And does anyone know what this is a rendering of? Yeah, someone got it for the first time. This is a scientist's rendition of dark matter, okay? And does anyone know what dark matter is, though? I asked because we don't, and If someone up there would like to chat afterwards, we would love to hear about it. But this is an active area of exploration for us, right? This is the majority of the known universe, and we're learning more about this every day. It's all around us, but we still don't know exactly what it is. And when we take this analogy home to us, what do we see in the dark data around our organization? We know it's all out there. We know there's all sorts of information we've been locking up. But what percentage of that is our universe and your universe? Okay, so to define that, dark data is the data all around us that we can't use today. We know it's there, we think it might be there, but we can't use it. And why can't we use it? Well, for a variety of reasons. Perhaps we can't find it. Data discovery is one of the big problems that I think we're all faced with today. But perhaps we can find it, but it's in some obscure format, and we can't quite interpret it. Or maybe we found it, interpreted it, but it's so large we can't process it. Or all these other hurdles that stand in our way from unlocking some of the crown jewels of our world around us. And I think the fundamental crime here is when we can't understand all this information, we can't imagine, right? We can't think about, well, if we could combine these pieces, then we could go a little bit further in our exploration. And this is something that's really important to us. This is a challenge that on April 23rd, the NASA administrator gave to us. And to paraphrase, if our species is to survive indefinitely, we need to become a multi-planet species, and Mars is a stepping stone to other solar systems. This is a huge challenge. Okay? And we've got some data to draw from to look at how we've done this in the past and how we can do this more successfully in larger scales in the future. If anyone saw our Curiosity rover land in 2012 in August, that's successful. We have got 2 rovers driving on the surface of the red planet today. And we're not stopping there. We're planning for a return of another version of a rover we're calling Mars 2020 that's supposed to launch, you guessed it, in 2020. And that's going to further our exploration to look at more types of information on that planet to learn more about what it's made of, how it's evolved, and how habitable that may be for the future. We're looking at larger missions too, like Mars Sample Return. Not just putting things on the red planet, but when we drop them, having something that can actually come back to bring samples home to really explore further. And to take this to the realm of science fiction, we're looking at in the next 20 years, thinking about how can we really put men on the red planet, and how can we use all the data that we've been collecting for the past 40 or 50 years in this case to help make these missions successful. So as our first step towards a solution, our IT CTO posed the question of, after exploring for all of these decades, what unfound discoveries lie in the data that we already have? Right? If we could look at that and interrogate that in new ways, what's possible? And the first stepping stone towards a solution to that is all of you. It's us. It's the data scientist. It's the person that can look at the data that we've been pulling home and hypothesize what might be possible, right? That's what's key about the science in our titles. It's the ability to fail, to ask questions, and to try to do things a little bit differently. And what's innate in that is the experimentation and ultimately the exploration at home that lets us explore further elsewhere as well. And when we look at a little bit why this is, I think, the right time for us to be solving these problems, we've got a lot at our disposal today. We've got a tremendous amount of tools, the software, the libraries that we can use right out of the gate helps us move really fast. We have these interpreted languages for the exploration piece where we'll start writing and interrogating our data before we quite know where we're going with it. We can move fast. Our tools allow for that design cycle. We have these active communities at home to help us when we're out exploring abroad, and scalable cloud computing and storage. So regardless of how much data we have or what we need to process, that infrastructure is available to us. That's no longer a problem. If we can visualize the largest data sets properly, we can then communicate to the public, to our peers, to our colleagues, why this is important. And finally, with some of these open source tools we have, I think we're all connected. We're all a part of a larger community, and we're all in this exploration together. Okay? So back to the data scientists at hand, what we're trying to do as we explore for the data that we have is 2 key things. We're first trying to liberate the dark data. This is the data that we can't use right now. And when that's been liberated, we're trying to enable our engineers so that their expertise can be applied. We know we're never going to know more about the data that someone spent their whole career collecting, but if we can help them move that much faster, we've done a service to everyone. So to that first key piece on liberation, it all starts here. Right? This is where our data comes home as we're exploring. We can process that in our local data center, and as needed, we can elastically burst up to really have the compute power that we need. One liberation example is where all of our Mars imagery from our last 3 rovers are now accessible through an endpoint json.jpl.nasa.gov. And this lets us do some really powerful things right away. Right? We can spin up our favorite editor, whatever that may look like, and we can import a simple library, pull down that URL, and in a couple blocks of code, we'll get all of the rovers, all of the days or the sols that we've been on Mars, and then we can look at all of the images too. And right inside of that iterative exploration notebook, we can now start to view these images. And this is now a stepping stone to explore further, to interrogate the imagery, to run image processing on this, to start helping other ideas and other algorithms really fuse with this data that we've been collecting, really lowering that barrier. Now, when we look around our organization, and I think most organizations, what makes this challenging is this architecture that's evolved over the last 5 or 10s or more years of closed silos. Everyone's had to create a data system. They've had to create it for a specific purpose. They've been budget and schedule constrained, and they haven't had the time to really build out maybe the rich APIs that we'd all like to see. So we find these closed silos all around us. And when we try to look at some of that data, it's just not going to happen unless we really know how to get in there today. This takes the form of a couple other prohibiting factors as well, where a lot of applications that we have to deal with have been designed for human consumption, but for reconsumption or reuse by our code as a data scientist that wants to take that further, it's just not there. It's only for some human to use through some predefined interface. Or lastly, what about those obscure connection strings that maybe you had written down in a notebook somewhere sometime years and years ago, right? We don't have access to that anymore. And this is locking up our data. So how do we tackle that? Well, I'm going to look at 3 simple approaches that we found fairly successful. There's this greedy solution of exploring for more data. There's this wise solution that I think everyone's given us this tip, well, it's not the data, it's the problem. And this last solution we'll look at is exploring for questions, a little bit different. Now, to this first approach, exploring for data, ideally, we would love to have APIs already accessible, but in some cases, we just don't have that. So to find the data that's all around us, we might explore for it. We might find some pieces of data or a database around our org, and we're going to get excited. We'll see data, and we'll think about what can we possibly do with that. But what I think this is missing is it's not quite the point to just find our data, because data is a means, it's not the end. The data did not come home for a specific purpose. A purpose was found or created, and the data came home for that. So our data maintainers are often not the folks that can help us really derive value out of that information. So that's what takes us to the next approach, where we explore for problems. Right? We explore around the organization and we find problems that are actively being looked at and things that need to be addressed today. When we find them, we can look at starting to integrate some of our solutions to these existing problems. And where I think this misses some of the tremendous value we can provide is where people are already working on these problems and they've been addressed for quite a while, we start to increment. And incremental successes are wonderful. But I think with some of these new tools, or some of the tools we're already using today, we can really revolutionize that. Okay, we can explore for questions. And this is where we take a slightly different approach, where we explore for these ideas. We find fairly often in our organizations, there are these long-standing questions that people have been tossing around, or crazy ideas that they've been suggesting for years. One of the orgs we finished with recently had been asking a question for over 10 years, and they hadn't seen an answer. So as we explore and find those questions, bringing in some new technology, we can rapidly prototype and reset those expectations, right? Like it's 2014, we have so much available to us today, we can solve these extremely rapidly. On our team, we have this philosophy where if we can't solve a problem in 2 weeks or less, or at least make substantial progress on it, we might not be ready to solve that today, because we want to find the largest possible impact that we can provide to our organization. And this can be really fun in the process too. Now, it's this question, looking for questions that connects us with these larger communities. This is a hackathon we engaged with recently called Hack Tech in Santa Monica, down in Los Angeles. I think over 1,200 people showed up, and these people are coming in to collaborate and work on tools and share what they've accomplished, in this case in 36 hours. And we can follow a similar pace. We can do this by looking outside of our org. How many people visit Hacker News on a regular basis? Yeah, these are places to find out what's available to us, where you can look at see what's ready to be implemented today, see some of the great work that our colleagues are doing, and we can bring that in. There are other places to look too. There's a data version of Hacker News that's been forked called Data Tau, where you can visit this today and find all sorts of technology that's really ready. If it's not ready for application, it's ready for a prototype. It's ready to help reset some expectations. And even Reddit, there's real information that we can use today. So knowing what's out there is really important. When we know what's out there, we can solve these problems together, and continue exploring for more questions. So we have this philosophy of exploring for questions, or question farming. This is something we learned from Jer Thorpe, a fairly prolific designer in New York, who uses his visualizations and his data outreach to pull in more questions, to engage more people, and to find a lasting impact that he can have. So what's an example of that? Well, if we look at our Curiosity rover, that gets packaged up tightly into one piece, and we've had thousands and thousands of people working on this piece. This is a combination model of our sky crane with the rover folded up inside. And when this is constructed with thousands and thousands of people, we think about our organization as a collective brain. There are all these lobes, from structural engineers to electrical, thermal, command and data handling, and all sorts of disciplines. And we want to make sure that our lab's brain is healthy. And when we started to look at a problem like this, some folks came to us and said, hey, I've got this data on some of the capabilities and skill sets. What do you think we could do with this data? Well, right away, that's not connecting directly with the sponsor. That was someone holding the data, and there's not much we can do without some serious approvals before we go into that sort of approach. So that was not a successful start for us. Someone else then came to us and said, well, I'm not an owner of the data, but I have a problem, and I want to know how healthy my lobe is. And we started talking to some folks about how we could possibly analyze that. And they said, well, wait a minute, that's a real problem. We've been looking at that for a while. This is how we approach it. This is our solution to that problem. And so we explored a little further, and we heard this idea. Someone was asking, what if we could see the brain evolve? What if we could see the capabilities and skill sets from year after year after year connect and evolve and see where things changed? And what if we could see that all in one place? The data we see quite a bit that these projects start with might look something like this. And to look at evolution in a workbook is a little challenging. So we thought a little bit outside the box, where we had seen other approaches to this type of evolution approach. And so this is a simple Sankey flow diagram. The colors are washing out a little bit, but it's connecting one edge to the next to show how something has evolved from one point in time to the next. And what we can do after we have this idea is we can fire up our trusty notebook, we can ingest that data quickly, and we can start experimenting. We can start looking at how we can connect our data with that visualization technique. And so what we did was we quickly pulled that in, presented that, showed it back to the person who had posed the idea, and they said, well, that's really interesting. Maybe we could take this a little bit further. And we started evolving on this question together, eventually coming into what's now showing a flow diagram that our leadership can see of how their capabilities have evolved from year after year after year. And this is now entirely automated and available on the web for them to really interact with and engage with their data. And so having liberated this, we can show them other directions that they can take it and farm for more questions. So one of the other questions that comes up after you have some successful demonstrations of what's possible is, what about this? What about my data? What if we could connect that in other ways? Or what about if we could connect that silo? And what we start to see pretty quickly is people are interested in these connections. It's the connections that let us do some really substantial things today. And so what this leads us to pretty quickly is the ability to graph our data, using graph databases to tie things together in brand new ways. And this is where we find some really interesting permutations on how we can explore for new data. And when we do this properly, we're using the Neo4j Web D3 REPL here, it becomes really responsive, it becomes really interactive. This is looking at some of my personal data here, and it becomes really engaging. Once we've graphed this, we can interrogate challenging questions at that graph, right? An example of how this ties together then is we typically start with a question, and we start to find some areas where that data might exist for that question. And there's always these new data sets that we find along the way. That's some of the dark data. And at the rate that new data is coming home, it's materializing all around us all the time, right? And that's where at the center of that, when we can start to connect these pieces together, that's where we find some really brand new value. And one example of where we took this last project a little bit further was where we took some of the geographic data and where we had been recruiting and finding these lobes of our brain, and we overlaid that on a heat map. Right? And we can show our leadership who really understands the context of this data, but now we present it to them in a slightly different way. We can overlay perhaps our strategic universities on top of that. And when we put this in a place where it can be fully automated and animated, we can now let them feel like they're a part of it, and they can touch and feel and interact with their data. And where we're going to finish here, so we're looping through some of the organizations that we have. And as we close in on one in particular, we'll see where these red circles, which are strategic schools, do not overlap with some of the blue circles, which is where we've been pulling those lobes from. And you can see right in the middle there's one mismatch. The largest blue circle doesn't have a red circle on it. And these folks that understand, the leaders, the experts that understand the data, when we can present this, all this tabular or dark data that they hadn't seen in this way, they can start to make brand new conclusions, right? And we empower them to make those conclusions. And so sitting at the center of this web of data all around us, we're trying to connect more of these pieces, and connecting your dots lets people see things in brand new ways. And as these webs start to grow, as your graph starts to grow, that's where we can liberate much more dark data. Now, once we've liberated, we want to enable them. And when we think about enabling, what we think about in our organization is we've got some of the smartest people that I've ever met working all around us. And our expertise looking at their data for the first time is never going to compare to what they've been learning for years. And so we have this chasm then between their expertise and their data, and we want to close this. So again, what we find is when we bring in some new technology, when we bring this in from the outside, right in the middle there, we find some low-hanging fruit. We find some marriages between the tools that already exist and the questions, the ideas, the crazy concepts that we can tackle pretty quickly. And that's the role that we see of our data science team inside the organization. Some tools that I think we all love that make this especially approachable are some of the frameworks that we can pull in right away. What makes this challenging a little bit, though, is if anyone's ever tried to configure matplotlib without, for someone without a strong technical background, it can be a little challenging. There's a lot of help on how to configure this on your machine. So now that we have some prepackaged environments that help us use this right out of the box, this helps us move that much faster. That many fewer hurdles to connecting our experts to our data. Getting to use a high-level and interpreted language like this, combined with a REPL, being able to run and execute our code remotely, and pulling that all the way to our browser, gives us some really awesome capabilities today. This is something that really empowers us. Now, we can't quite use all the publicly available sites. We have controls in our data, as do many of you. We can't push our data out here. But thanks to the open source community and how we can all collaborate and tie together, we can pull this inside. We can pull this inside, and we've done so people can share, they can look at our notebooks, and we can securely collaborate on our internal projects and our internal code. Now, as we're working on and defining these projects, there's a quote that I think is really important to keep in mind. And so this is something Drew Conway said. And what I think he means by this is that the answer is not always in the algorithm, right? We have to engage with those around us. This is where we find lasting and sustainable value. And one of the ways that we find is really effective, of course, at taking some first steps through here is through visualization, right? It's all about how we present this that starts the conversation, so we can start climbing further up into that tree. And we can take a traditional approach. We can create something that they may have seen before. But when we're doing this, we want to be careful too that we're not showing them that we have the answers. And some simple modifications to a chart like that can show them really easily, right, that we're not showing them the exact answer, but we're helping them look at things a slightly different way. And so engaging first and helping them answer their questions has been really powerful for us. And this is something that, as of a few merges ago, is now integrated into the iPython stack. So we like that quite a bit. I would also be remiss if I was up here without showing the latest XKCD, which is entirely true. A 4-year degree in orbital mechanics is not enough to stay on top of that. So as we're moving in this direction, something that Jason touched on before is the Cadillac of presenting or visualizing our data on the web today is really D3. There are some great projects in the work in the Python community, but I think this is still the Cadillac. And so we use this quite a bit. This helps us create really compelling visuals, create them responsively, and right in a web browser. And that's important so people can touch them without having to install or jump over any further barriers to touch. This is, of course, the D3 showreel. And so this is something we can start using today too. We might start with a data frame in Pandas from whatever data source we pulled from, and there's a Python Vincent library that interfaces directly with iPython, which will compile to this Vega. It's a JSON descriptor language, which will help us create a D3 scheme graph, which we can pull right inside of our notebook. So with one more pip install and import, we can start to use that library to create really beautiful visuals right out of the gate. And what's great about this is it helps us prototype right in our notebook for something that we can connect with a D3 visualization in a later iteration of the project. And that's often when we start stepping outside of our notebook, where when we start with some data, we start with this really compelling workflow of being able to ingest that right into our iterative exploration environment, and we can move back and forth. We can try new things and iterate. And where we can take this to create some RESTful interface, that's where we can do really interactive and empowering things in the browser that have connected from this workflow that we know and love on the back end. And that ties our data all the way to our user. That's how we can really enable them. Now, for one last example to pull all these pieces together, how we can make a difference with this. After we've pulled our data home from space through the DSN, through our cloud, we'll have that data that our engineers can see and touch with their tools. But when we're exploring for questions, one question that came through was, what if we could interact with all of the data that we pulled home from our rover? And what our engineers were asking for, what they really wanted, was something like this, something like Google Finance, where they could search for any telemetry channel. And once they've found that, they could plot that. And by bringing in some new technology to that stack, we've created something like this. And so this is a tool that our engineers are using today in their browser, where they can search for any telemetry channel. And normally there are some more descriptive names when it's used internally. And after they've selected that, they can look over all the data points that we've ever pulled home. And when they find an area that's especially interesting, they can zoom all the way in to look just at that point in time on the surface to really interrogate and understand. And this connects our experts directly with all the data that they've ever pulled home. And this is something that really empowers them today. And after showing this to some of our engineers, another idea came through. And it was, now that we can interact and touch our data points, what if we could get even closer? And I'm not going to show you what some of our other colleagues are doing with the Oculus today. But one of those endpoints where that data is available is all the imagery that we pulled home. It's public information. It's accessible online. And after liberating that and putting that in the cloud in a web browser so you can interrogate and search for any image that our rovers have pulled home, so we can facet on different types of cameras, different parts of the rover, in an extremely responsive way. We made this tool also with reuse in mind. So as you're typing, it's helping compile RESTful API queries so you can embed this in other tools. And what's possible by having liberated, yeah, we haven't filtered that yet. We'll see if anybody in the room is an expert on that. So this takes it back to a RESTful API with a format that we're all comfortable consuming, right? And what we can do is all these pieces start to tie together in that graph or in this web that we've created to empower folks, to really let them, when they find a data point they want, they can touch it, they can look at the image, they can feel like there's no barrier between their expertise and their data. So to pull that back to the dark data that we've been working to liberate, for that dark data, we're looking for those questions. We're looking for the questions that have been long-standing that we can solve with a new approach or a radical new idea today. And it's the people around our organization that help make that possible. When we can enable their expertise to interact with their data in brand new ways, then we've been successful. So to summarize, to liberate your dark data, to enable your engineers, I think we can grow data science together. I think we can be incredibly successful at that. And I think we can have a lot of fun in the process. So thank you for sitting through. And I'll be here for a few questions, or you're all free to head back to 18 for lunch. Thank you. You can shout it out if you want, or we can hang out after. Cool.
So can you talk a little bit about the scientific data solutions you use, the data formats, or what is NASA or JPL, what do they rely on? You know, in my work, I work with a lot of float data, numerical test data, kind of analogous to the type of sensor data you have, right?
Sure.
Except it's on Earth. But do you find that like solutions like Hadoop or stuff available in Amazon EC2, is that not enough to solve the sort of load 10 million floats and do some regression or do some machine learning on it? Do you find barriers there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are barriers all around. So scientific data, HDF4, HDF5, NetCDF, that's kind of the bread and butter of the science community, right? NASA has then created our data archival and access centers, which are distributed around the country, which are collecting that data, and scientists can go to those locations to analyze their data. As the scale of those data files is growing, it's getting to the point where we can no longer bring those data sets home and truly experiment in an agile way. So what we're looking at are bringing together more resources and helping through more co-location, standardization, and more collaboration across our centers. How can we create those data archives and data locations that both compute and storage are localized on, of course, so our scientists can query remotely. So to evolve to a more capable and a more agile infrastructure like that, we're working with our partners around the agency to look at sort of new architectures for that today. So it's a very active topic of interest. Yes.
One of your slides, you showed hypotheses. You have a lot of data out there, and you can raise hypotheses today and test them against the data. Can you give an example of concrete example that actually has been helpful doing this? Yeah,
this is often. So when we're posing a hypothesis, it's the ability to approach and prototype around that really makes it powerful today. And so we look for prototypes as fast as possible. When someone has a crazy idea, we have this concept of an innovation vacation at JPL, and we'll pull them into our lab, we'll work with them for 1 to 2 weeks, and we'll build out that hypothesis. One example in sort of our data science realm where we've accomplished that recently is we had this question. So we're sending another rover to Mars in 2020. And we have just placed Curiosity on Mars. And there was this hypothesis that all the data we've generated for MSL, well, why can't we reuse that for this Mars 2020 rover? And so over a 1-week period, we gained access to pull out some of that data, index that in Elasticsearch, and present that on the web for their engineers on Mars 2020 to start in real time searching, interacting, and finding data that they can reuse. And what makes that hypothesis sort of how we substantiate our approach to that is by having a deliverable that people can use and looking at the metrics on how that is used. So in that case, that's been a fairly successfully tested hypothesis that we can liberate and help our engineers search and engage and iterate through some of that data. As often as possible, we will fail on those hypotheses as well. That's often less than a week or two, but it's the ability to pose a crazy idea, bring in some new technology, and deliver something as quickly as possible that we try and simplify.
I was curious about what portion, say, scientists and engineers at NASA are actually using Python or PyData, and how PyData could be more relevant to them.
How PyData could be more relevant to them. It's a topic we're thinking about quite a bit. We had Peter and some of the folks from Continuum by JPL a couple months ago. I think we had just about a standing room only event there. So the interest is really high. We're engaging them more by bringing in things like our internal notebook viewer now. So we have a place to point folks to where they can really quickly see the power of what we can do in a couple lines of high-level code using some of these libraries. Further diminishing that barrier, we're bringing in new things like Wakari now. So we have not just a hosted place to look, but a hosted place to execute as well. Once we have that kind of infrastructure in through outreach, through sharing some of the tools that we've created, and more traditional means as well, like more talks and more direct marketing, if you will, inside of our agency, I think we're going to be pretty successful. There are a lot of people that are really interested, and so on our team, we're incubating some of those tools that they'll be able to use. Some they can, others in the next few weeks. All right, so how about we all get some lunch? Thank you.